Good evening, and welcome to this last panel of our panel series that we organized for the opening of the Goethe-Institut in Exile. My name is Marc-André. I'm working for the Goethe-Institut in Munich in the headquarters in the cultural division. I'm part of the organizing team as well here of Goethe-Institut in Exile. Goethe-Institut in Exile is a project that we started now this week actually, and will last till end of 2024. And it's something that is new experiment actually for us. And I want to maybe just make a quick remark before I introduce the panel. It's a bit cozy on the stage, but I think. Yes, this panel is not the last one. It's the last one for this festival, but not the last public discussion we will have in this place. During these previous days, we talked about many different topics that will continue to play a big role in sharpening the conceptual work of this new structure that is Goethe-Institut in Exile. We started with discussing cultural narratives and who defines them within the current context of the war in Ukraine, a topic that we could also address within the Syrian, the Afghanistan, or the Belarusian context, or any illiberal context that we witness these days. We talked as well about the question on how to preserve cultural goods and cultural practice in countries with illiberal systems, and discussed the options that could be developed towards a more sustainable approach to the safeguarding of these goods and practices. Cultural policies and spaces, they're reducing independence and their strategies against illiberal context, where at the core of the third panel, which we did together with the DEZIM, the Deutsches Zentrum für Migrations- und Integrationsforschung, we heard different experiences from Belarus and Syria and discussed what could be the future role of such cultural spaces like the Goethe-Institut in Exile. And just now, the panel before this one, we've talked on the different personal experiences of artists at risk and in their position towards exile and towards the receptiveness as well of the German cultural landscape. All these threads are pouring into what Goethe-Institut in Exile will become. It is not something where we can only rely on our 70-year-long experience of working abroad within specific cultural and regional frameworks. And Goethe-Institut in Exile is not the ultimate answer to the pressing issues of our times. We do not yet know how the structure will evolve and will be accepted as well, will be transformed by its partners, its audience, and its co-creators. But what we do know is that we want to be as open and as inclusive, as welcoming, and as supportive as our institutes abroad. They had to be forced to physically close their doors. It is a new way of thinking cultural exchange in times when this exchange is massively threatened by growing geopolitical and illiberal pressures, by regimes that see culture as a threat and want to oppress it by all means. The current protests in Iran are reminding us in very drastic ways of what it is at stake and what it means to defend basic human rights. And while we want to see Goethe-Institut in Exile as this flexible and agile structure, we are still part of a large institution that is depending on public funding and has a very own velocity of dealing with new topics. What role can therefore these cultural institutions, can public institutions in general play in this context? What are the possible responses and the mechanisms that need to be developed when the frequency of regional conflicts is rapidly increasing, when illiberal contexts are not the exception, but becoming more and more dominant? I'm very happy to discuss these questions with our panelists and briefly want to introduce them to you. We have Marita Mukkonen and Ivo Stodolski, who are the founding directors of the international NGO Artists at Risk that is based in Finland. Both have an artistic and curatorial background in contemporary arts and have designed and curated many international exhibitions and symposiums. With Artists at Risk, that was founded almost 10 years ago, they've started a worldwide network working on a rapid response mechanism to support cultural practitioners that are immediately threatened by political oppression, by terror or war. They've been able to support artists in many countries, ranging from Afghanistan to Vietnam, from Egypt to Belarus, and most actively just now as well in Ukraine, where we are cooperating on a joint program. Thank you for being present here today. I'm looking forward to your perspectives. Matthias Paes. Thank you. Matthias Paes has just recently started his tenure as artistic director of the Berliner Festspiele. He gained intensive experience in various fields and several aspects of the performing arts as both artistic and managing director of the international production house Künstlerhaus Musanturm in Frankfurt-Main, from 2013 to 2022, as leading dramaturge at the Wiener Festwochen from 2010 to 2013, and amongst many other positions as founder and co-manager director of the international production agency ProdArt.br in Sao Paulo. He initiated and contributed to large-scale interdisciplinary festivals and cooperation projects with partners, including the Ensemble Modern, the Jewish Museum Frankfurt, and is also active as a cultural journalist and theater critic. Thank you for being here today, Matthias. Per Brandt, colleague from mine, has worked for the Goethe-Institut in Germany, in India, and in Russia. Most recently, he was the director of the Goethe-Institut in Novosibirsk, where his focus included promoting civil society and supporting artists at risk. Since June 2022, he has been the Goethe-Institut's representative in the leadership team of the Roth-Initiative, a global protection program for cultural workers from illiberal context. The Berlin-based Roth-Initiative is a joint project of IFA, the Institute for Auslandsbeziehungen, and the Goethe-Institut, funded by the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. We will hear more about it. Thank you for coming. And last but not least, Christian Mier is a journalist, human rights activist, and expert on international media policy. He has been managing director of Reporters Without Borders since 2012. He is a board member of the Spanish organization Access Info Europe and an appointed member of the Communication and Information Committee of the German Commission for UNESCO. Before joining Reporters Without Borders, he worked for several years as a journalist for print and online media in Germany and Ecuador, and lectured in journalism training for a German foundation in southern Russia. Thank you as well for being here this evening. We have a very broad range of backgrounds here, which is very interesting for us. And you're representing different players that are active in the field of support to endangered artists and media persons. And I want to center this discussion on two central questions. One would be the role and responsibility that cultural institutions working with public funding in countries like Germany have towards media persons, towards journalists, artists at risk. And the other one would be to discuss what could be the way forward to more structural cooperation and collaboration within this context. I want to start with you, Matthias. What would you say towards the first question? What is the role that an institution, for instance, like the Berliner Festspiele, can play in the context of artists at risk? What is the responsibility, for instance, as well, of such institutions in this context of illiberal context, in the illiberal systems where we are hosting artists at risk in Germany?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are several layers on which this question could be understood and addressed. Of course, there is an urgent one, which in the last years has come much closer to us in the selection of artists that have just been here on this panel, and that somehow also left me kind of clueless in many senses, and also sad. Of course, showed how many different artists at risk are here and work here. And of course, there's several very practical things artistic institutions can do and should do, maybe even before people have to be saved in a certain way from such an illiberate situation that it ends up for them with an arrest or prison or other complete incapacities to work anymore. And that, of course, has to do with production and producing internationally, of course, gives us with the very huge privilege of very well-financed and established cultural institutions in Germany on all different levels, in our cities, in our states, and on our federal level, has always given us and still gives us the possibility to support a lot of work structures also outside of Germany. It is a practice, I would say, in the field I have worked to do so. And of course, many relationships to people that maybe now are in a situation of such a risk that it's really about getting them out or somewhere and support them on the spot. Many of those artists simply have collaborated with many of our institutions beforehand, and I think that's a very good practice and is a possibility to set a certain, to build on a certain connection. It's also a good option and possibility for the persons to come, that they feel not only in a completely new and abrupt situation of connection, but that there is something to build on. So it's also of course, and that's more a structural or general answer to this question, not depending so much on the situation we are in now, is like, how can we invest in structures that at the first hand invest in production possibilities and in civil and artistic structures existing in many parts of the world that are lacking of sufficient either funding or visibility or even possibility to work or to show work to a broader audience in their countries. How can we contribute to this? And how can we build up relations before such a situation like we have heard about today?
And would you say there is this responsibility as well that you have as a German cultural institution towards this, to react actually to this situation?
I'm just a little shy to overestimate those institutions or cultural institutions. Of course, every civic person has a responsibility, and of course everybody in institutions that can contribute to a better situation for any person in this has this responsibility, of course. But it's a very important question. How do we do so? Like not only today, but where did we come from? Where do we start from? And what does this mean for the future? Are we also, because I think that is the deeper responsibility we would have, is like, can we also invest in those structures so that they can go on? Because all these situations, as we see now, they are not like a situation of today. We are all facing, with all the projects and all the collaborations we started with artists from Lebanon or Syria, for example, we see this is an ongoing situation. It's not something we solve by something very activistic and short-handed, which of course sometimes is the most important thing to do. Just do it quickly. But how does it go on?
Thank you. And I will take up this activistic mention. And Marita and Ivo, you founded this international NGO that has rapidly evolved into a worldwide network of satellites and matching points, all aiming at supporting these endangered artists. What has this process been like? How have you managed the structural adaptation of your NGO to the different crisis contexts that you are working and that have you encountered over the years? So it has from maybe just give a little presentation upon where you started and where you are now, because you are now very present as well.
Yeah, it has been a long way in 10 years. But as you introduced us, both of us, Ivor and I, we are and we were curators in contemporary art when we started Artists at Risk. And very simply grew out of the need of our colleagues, of our peers, of curators, of artists who were at risk in the countries already back then, in the countries like Russia. We worked, for example, with Nadia Tolonikova when she was in prison for the first time for 2 years. We worked in Northern Africa. We were doing curatorial research there with the revolutionary movements. And as we know that there was a big backlash in countries like Egypt, that artists and activists who joined the revolutions in 2013, they were already in that situation that they were tortured, they were facing the threats to be imprisoned. And we very simply at that time actually started to map that other organizations and institutions who are working with artists at risk. Of course, we all know the long history of PEN International working with artists and journalists, but it's very clear that dissidents of today, they are not only writers, poets, and journalists, but they are artists of all disciplines. And first, our focus was in visual arts. It's basically that time we worked in Helsinki in artist in residency context. So it was very natural. It is basically to provide artists in residencies, because it means that artists who are dissidents, who are activists, it's the best to arrive to professional context. It's best to arrive in the context actually where your other peers are. You have a social context, you have artistic context, and starting point in our work is always that we work with artists as art professionals, not as refugees. So basically, we have developed different mechanisms to network artists to its local networks and so on. But you want to continue? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Take this mic. So, thanks also from me, Marc-André, for the invitation to this panel and to this entire Goethe in Exile project. But just to continue what Marita was saying, I mean, you kind of asked about the origins of the project, and she was indicating that we, as curators, as activists in the field, like, actually from the field, had the experience of working with artists that just simply couldn't be sent back. You invite an Egyptian to an exhibition in Western Europe, and then they're going to go back and face torture, several years in prison. God knows if they'll ever survive. You can't do that. So that's when Marita and I started mapping, those institutions that would be able to receive them, and we honestly just couldn't find them. And there was no PEN International for anything but writers and journalists, so we had to kind of more or less invent it. And that's what we were doing about 10 years ago. And we told ourselves, okay, we only really know the visual arts because that's where we're from. That's our curatorial practice. I mean, although both of us actually have backgrounds in politics, if you see the bios, I worked in media, international media. Marita also was in parliament. But we realized that we had to go beyond that because one of the first residents was the author of the anthem of the Egyptian revolution. He was a musician, so how can we say no to somebody who wouldn't find a home in a safe place? So we basically had to expand very rapidly into all genres and fields and receive those that we were working with on a kind of one-to-one basis. And so for over the years, just to kind of make a long story short, we had been already working with dissident Russian artists from even the Soviet period. That was our first show together in Helsinki. Then we were working with anti-Putin protest art from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, a very big project in Norway. And then we started doing the Egyptian kind of MENA region kind of research and found we can't just send them back. And so this is where we said, well, we have to kind of formalize that entire process, and began building a kind of more or less an activist NGO. We hesitated for a long time to call ourselves an NGO because we, from the artistic field, NGOs like a UFO comes down. I'm not criticizing anybody on the panel, but that's what it's seen as. Somebody from somewhere else that comes into the field, whereas we came from the roots, so to speak, from the grassroots, and that kind of helped us understand how they think. And I think that is something that's now being absorbed by the NGO world in a way that I kind of hear from many organizations that they're saying, oh, we have to embed the artist in an artistic context. Yes, of course, they're artists. And as Marita said, our first premise is they're artists. We treat them as artists, not as refugees, not as black, white, green, yellow, or anything else. We say, you're an artist, and we're going to work with you, a cultural activist or a cultural worker. So this is how we developed it. And I think that, well, with Ukraine, or first with Afghanistan, things change rapidly. Maybe we'll get back to that, or should we?
Can expand a little bit on that. Yeah.
Okay, because it was really case-by-case basis for many years, and we had dozens and dozens of residents, but in about 26 countries, 26 locations in 20 countries. But Marita, would you like to continue on how things change with Afghanistan?
It is basically, by then, as Ivor said, that we had its 26 hosting hubs around the world, is hosting artists at risk residents. And we were, of course, receiving lots of applications, more that we could host. It's in the terms of threatened artists. But with Afghanistan, it's basically, there was a total wave of applications. We received with our partners 450 applications, 2,000 people with dependents. And what we did was that we started to develop something we called solidarity teams. And we have a solidarity team working with Afghanistan, which consists of activist artists from Afghanistan because they know the situation best. So we started to form the teams. It is basically, we had regional specialists before, but we started to actually also integrate and basically cooperate more with our peer organizations, with other NGOs, simply so that artists don't need to apply for so many institutions. But if you are in the run, you don't have internet, you are hiding, you just can't fill in forms for every single NGO or institution. So actually, we gathered forces with 10, 15 different active actors. It's basically activist NGOs, and we coordinated the lists. We call it list of the lists, and started to work on that and identify the most urgent cases who had to be relocated. It's a long story it's go through. It's basically, of course, we are still working with this list, as all of us know who work with Afghan artists at risk. Actually, just now, last week, we are hosting here in Berlin now, it's 8 Afghan artists at risk, and with some of them we have been working now for 1 year to get them to Germany. So it has been very slow. But our working model, it's changed that way, that we work in much broader way. We cooperate and we include local activists and specialists more in our daily operations. Same happened when war in Ukraine started, unexpected, that we created a solidarity team working with Ukrainians, and we work with Goethe-Institut with the same model, that we have 6 Ukrainians working together with national curators from Germany, from Sweden, from Spain, so they know very well their institutional landscape. They know the art institutions. So we have networks of art institutions like in Germany. It's basically who apply to Goethe, and in Goethe side also you know well these institutions, and our Ukrainian matchmakers are the ones who know the best the artists from their country. So it's kind of a speed dating when you have to work fast, but it goes fast because basically you have specialists from both sides. And same happens, for example, in Sweden we have a network of 50 residencies. It is all of Sweden, and matchmakers work in the same way. There are 2-3 people who are Swedish and they know the institutional landscape there. Same in Finland, same in Spain, and so on. And we are doing the same, for example, now, or have been doing since the war started with Russian dissidents as well.
So this model, which we developed kind of shortly before Goethe approached us, and was kind of then being implemented in real, was then really fulfilled by the Goethe kind of funding and cooperation partnership. And so this model, as Marita just mentioned, is already also in operation in Spain, in Italy to some extent. Belgium is joining, and further. And I think we could get to this at a later point in the panel when we have a discussion about how it can be internationalized. And so it's not a national issue, of course. I mean, if you're fleeing from a war, you're not really interested whether you're necessarily going to end up in this country or that country of Western Europe or of the EU. And currently, I just wanted to maybe just so we have the scale is just staggering, just to kind of understand the difference between having, a trickle of, like, say, 3 to 5, maybe 10 applications a week. We now have 1,750 Ukrainian artists on our list, right? We have 360 oppositional Russian and Belarusian artists on our list. We have approximately 500 hosting organizations which apply to host these artists at risk. And we have approximately a relocation level currently around 232 Ukrainian principals. That's not considering their dependents, their children, their grandmothers, their pets. And 97, sorry, that was and then approximately 80 from Russia and Belarus that we've relocated in the last few months. So the scale is just very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much for this intense look or this kind of really detailed look into this, into your work. And I would give over the word to Per Brandt. You have gained as well some insights in the support of endangered artists, now working with the Martin Roth-Initiative. And how would you describe this work of the Martin Roth-Initiative within the German context, within the framework of different support mechanisms that are being active, that are there, that are active on various levels? How would you kind of situate the Martin Roth-Initiative there as well?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation as well. Well, the Martin Roth-Initiative was founded out of an appeal by German cultural institutions to the German government back in 2017 to initiate a program for their colleagues abroad, colleagues like Kirill Serebrennikov and others. A lot of these institutions were from the theater field. And in 2018, the project was launched as a joint initiative by Goethe and IFA, very closely linked and funded by the Foreign Ministry. There are similar programs for scientists at risk, and for human rights defenders at risk, that are also funded directly in a similar fashion by the foreign ministry. So what we're doing is not funding artists directly, but we are funding institutions, theaters, exhibition places, and so on, who are then hosting artists, both within Germany, which is usually for a year or something like that, and in neighboring countries, which is usually sort of 3 to 5 months. So I think, and usually these are stays, sort of the big advantage that we can offer is that through this link to the Foreign Office, we have the possibility to give visa to people. So we're specialized on artists from countries who don't have an access to Germany, where there's no visa regime that allows them to come here. And the second advantage is that we have these host organizations, because I think, as one of you said, it only makes sense for an artist to be here if they also have the possibility to get integrated somehow in the artistic world. So we do this via these host organizations. The third advantage might be this large network of 157 Goethe-Instituts worldwide that sometimes act as host organizations themselves, but who also act sort of as a radar system, who identify people who are in need or who are perhaps approached by artists in their countries and will then redirect to us, or people who approach us that we can redirect to them. But I would like to comment briefly on one of the earlier things you said, was a question of whether we have a responsibility. I would say we don't only have a responsibility, we have an interest. Of course we have a responsibility. In a certain sense it's historic. The earliest programs for artists or intellectuals, actually scientists at risk, date back to the Nazi time, with British organizations hosting German scientists. And of course we have obligations specific to each country. For example, to Afghanistan, we have an obligation after these 20 years in that country. You might say we have a special obligations towards Ukraine after, to say the least, a controversial foreign policy with regard to Eastern Europe, with regards to energy policies that have also played a role in leading us to the situation we are in now. So we have these responsibilities, that's right. But from a Goethe point of view, if Goethe wants to be more than just an institution that promotes German language and German culture, that facilitates dialogues and cooperations, but if Goethe really wants to be in illiberal contexts, sort of a free space where brave artists can perform, where they can realize projects, then we also need protection mechanisms, because these free spaces don't exist. They exist in a context that's not free. So whenever you do something in a Goethe-Institut in a country like, say, Russia, it will have consequences afterwards. So if this is not to be some kind of kamikaze mission to do a project in a Goethe-Institut in an illiberal context, you need protection mechanisms, and ideally you also need exile mechanisms, like the ones you've been setting up here now with the Goethe-Institut in exile. But it's an interest also in a sense that I think the work that we're doing in these countries is to support democratic forces within authoritarian countries. In a time where we see we're not anymore in a phase where you would say we are in a competition of narratives between authoritarian countries and democratic countries. We're closer to something that is a new Cold War. And in a situation like that, I think it's, well, actually in our national interest to support forces in those countries who are democratic minded. That means that we also need these protection mechanisms, and we need to give them the funding that they need to operate. So I was very happy to see that in the new German coalition, in the coalition of the new German government, funding programs are meant to receive more funding. Now we're in a difficult situation, but I think it's important to convince also the politicians that this is not just a matter of altruism. This is a matter of interest. to Germany and to our credibility as well in these countries. Just to add to that point as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I want to ask you, Christian Mir. You are representing Reporters Without Borders, and you follow, of course, the international crisis situation very closely. Have just recently launched this support fund for journalists in exile, the JX Fund. Can you give us maybe some information on how this fund came into being and what was the motivation was behind it? And maybe it's what in regards to what was said before now.
Yeah, actually, well, Reporters Without Borders, we are a campaigning organization, an advocacy organization working globally. We're not a German organization. And we actually, since many years in the framework of our assistance work, we support individual journalists, but very often we face crisis and we observe crisis where complete newsrooms, complete organizational structures leave the country and they have to stop their work. And then in a very complicated way, we observed that actually in the situation of exile in the last 10, 20 years, whenever a situation of exile happens, actually some newsrooms survive under very difficult conditions because they apply for complicated project funding or they create totally new projects, but always as well ending up in long project funding cycles. And now in the last 2 years, I would say, starting with Myanmar, then following Afghanistan, now following the war in Ukraine, but with many newsrooms leaving Russia, actually in this momentum, Reporters Without Borders, together with 2 German foundations, the Schöpflin Foundation and the Rudolf Augstein Foundation, we created a completely new organizations, because the so-called JX Fund, where we are offering immediate support for newsrooms who actually want to keep on working right after their refuge and not ending up in project cycles. Like, as you said, with the artists, trusting those people, trusting those newsrooms. They know how to do journalism. They know how to work. But what is actually lacking is actually a business model right after the refuge, right after having left the country. And they just need money to develop this, but not for actually silencing their voice. And this is actually why we created this new organization, which is now really an independent company, a German non-profit company. And we have funded since March actually almost 40 newsrooms from Russia, from Belarus, from Ukraine. And actually now the next aim, if to say so, is after this momentum, if to say so, of this war having taken place and actually mobilizing so much money, both private money, both state-funded money, now actually to expand this, and we really want to be this new organization, actually the player, if one to say, really for flexible media in exile, and not concentrating on individual journalists, but really on complete newsrooms in order to take them serious to do their work.
And you mentioned it earlier, Matthias, the sustainability, and you just mentioned it as well now. How can one secure this sustainability in a way? Because this is what we're facing as well. You just mentioned it. There's a big focus on Ukraine now, and we discussed it in the earlier panel as well. There are new crises coming up and so on. How do you kind of manage to keep this focus on the work you're doing, and not just on the crisis, but on the sustainable work that is done then?
I mean, the mediums themselves, part of our JX Fund is actually offering them as well support, consultancy in business models, developing business model, putting them in touch with successful other models, because there are already existing successful media in exile, but which had to take a long road. For example, Meydan TV from Azerbaijan, for example, Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka, for a long time, Uz News has been an example, for a long time, The Voice of Burma. But they are all success stories, but they all had a very long path. This is one thing. And our whole own organization is actually, we try to be sustainable, because I think we have found quite an innovative setup. One NGO together with 2 foundations as 3 equal shareholders, and this looks like, for the time being, that this for actually funders is an attractive model, and funders which we normally as RSF, as Reporters Without Borders, don't want to, because we normally as Reporters Without Borders, we are funded by private donations, and so to to some extent, this JX fund allows us, together with the two foundations, to accept money which we normally as an organization don't want to have. And it looks like actually we now have a budget in a year, less than a year, a budget of almost 4 million, in which I think it's quite impressive for having started a new organization.
Thank you. And maybe continue a little bit in this direction. Marita and Ivo, you are active of course, a very international context and have many different experiences as well on the ground. But when you look specifically at Germany and the way that institutions are dealing with supporting artists in Germany, what is it that comes to your mind actually when you look and compare it maybe to other countries where you have as well your experiences with? You mentioned the Swedish model and so on. What is it, if you look from this outer perspective on Germany? What comes to your mind there?
I think I refer it to a symposium which was organized at ZKM in Karlsruhe before the war broke out in Ukraine. It's basically, and we called it Alliances for Art at Risk. And I think in German institutions, it could be like everywhere. I think it's not only Germany, it's Europe, it's in general. Actually, it's this openness, it's for dissident artists, curators, art practitioners within their structures, because it's very clear that when we talk about dissident artists, curators, art professionals, they are at risk because they are often very good, strong artists. And I think that has been something, it's for me working as a curator and artist at risk, that's one of the biggest privileges, is actually to meet these artists from Iraq, from Afghanistan and so on, which are not into international circulation. And basically they are very, very strong artists, it's who you are hosting. And I think that is basically people who come, it's from countries because they are at risk, that they also should be kind of not only visiting its people, but they should be more also invited to be part of its daily structures. For example, it is within art institutions, in curating, it's in programming and so on, because they have that capability. And maybe second point, I think which is very important to make always, is that many dissident artists actually, they want to go back if they can, because it's not so easy to be engaged dissident artist. It's when you are in exile. And we have several residents who have returned back even to countries like Syria. They are in Aleppo now. But it's very difficult for them to get support. It is to their structures and what they are doing there, which is very crucial for kind of democratic development in these countries. And I think that's one of the focuses we have also talked is also with Marc-André also when it comes to Ukraine, that for example, as Artists at Risk, we have now developed a residency program within Ukraine in the safe areas, because it's also very important that artists don't need to stay in Europe because they have support here, but they don't have support when they go back. And I think this is something in the funding models that it should be taken into account much more, that actually if artists go back, there would be mechanisms also to go back to. And basically, we have a small fund, which we called AR Bridging Fund, which we use to this cause, also to support those artists who want to go back, but we naturally have very little limited resources for that. But I think these kind of considerations are important to think also, that not everybody wants to necessarily stay if they can go back.
Mm-hmm. I'm coming maybe back to one point that we discussed or that was discussed in the previous panel, and I want to ask you, Matthias, then, because you are planning together with Matthias Liedenthal and Ravi Moe a large performance festival next summer titled Performing Exile, and we have this JX fund for journalists in exile. We are sitting here in the Goethe-Institut in exile. Many other institutions use this label exile as currently for their events, and is it maybe not a risk as well of overusing it, of randomizing it, or do we have on the contrary maybe the need actually for this label to confront as well the audience with the context, with the reality that most of this audience have not experienced by themselves? What would you say?
I think at first it's a very important development in the last 10, 15 years with all those developments for artists at risk and structures at risk that have followed one the other and one each other, to realize that, to believe that living in this kind of safe place, which we call our nation, that this is a kind of illusion. And André mentioned it in the debate before. You just don't realize yet that this will attack you as well in the way one cannot say, but we are not, I think, distinguishing or separating the world in those areas where people are actually at risk and where they are not. That is a kind of, I mean, I don't want to be cynical. Of course, I feel very safe in the moment, compared especially to all those people that sat here on the podium before. But I think that's another side of, we're calling the whole time our world a globalized one, a post-nation one. This is also part of that reality. So, and discussing exile or a situation of exile, that's a relative situation. Describing somebody that has been somewhere else before and is now in a new situation, that is something in also, especially due to our history in Germany, in the arts has been elaborated and discussed and described in so many different ways. It's a part of our, in a certain way, literal and artistic consciousness. So I think there is a relation to this which is not at risk to extrapolate this and overdo this terminology. I think it is important to address an artist as an artist and not as a refugee or as an exile, even if the situation of refuge, as Mohammed said before, is something, once you have gone through this, you will always be a refugee. You'll not get rid of this even if the political situation or your personal situation has changed. Now, so it is an experience that when you talk about the interest, I think there's also an interest on the level of understanding and not only on solidarity, but also on a deeper understanding of life, what is in this. So if we talk about artists at risk, we talk about those artists, and we talk about people in one world that have to somehow deal with the world we all live in together, and we all are maybe more, maybe less endangered in a situation we have to face together. So I think those kind of projects or those kind of activities, and the project you mentioned has a very playful idea, saying this maybe we should understand the city we live in here in Berlin as a new city of exile. So maybe in the end we all realize that in a certain way exile is something we can relate to or deal with, all of us, in a different way. And that also means not othering and not excluding or not specializing those people, but like go back to their artwork and watch it through other eyes, own eyes, different eyes.
Thank you. Yeah, Christian, please.
Two comments. One comment exactly on the term and the expression of exile. I think interesting. I would say that not I would say, if you language-wise and culture-wise, it's the expression exile indeed in some languages does not exist with this understanding. For example, in Dari, in Pashto, in Afghanistan, this is something which I actually learned in the last years already, that actually when we talk about exile, it's an expression which in Dari and Pashto you have to explain a bit more with all the understanding which we actually give to this expression, especially in Germany, especially in Russia, where we have with this almost romantic feelings with this expression of exile. There's just one comment. And on your comment on actually preparing for going back, and actually on your comment, and I think this, of course, this always has to be the work. It's less about integration here, that is sometimes a misunderstanding, and it's more for preparing actually going back, and this is not something hypothetical. I will, and there's, from the media field, I can explain, I know many examples where actually were success stories. For example, Voice of Burma, actually a successful media radio station which in 2012 went back. Now again we have, of course, another fallback in Myanmar, but they have have been from Norway preparing a very successful radio broadcasting program. Uzbekistan, there's examples which after some development have been in the last year, some media in exile went back, and I think this is not something theoretical, but something very practical, and I think all the media in exile we are supporting, actually, they do have this perspective, and that's why we want to enable them, and that's why we enable them to go on working right after their refuge.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could step back a little bit, and if we're really just talking about the cultural aspect of being in exile, being a refugee, or being, I think we have to go far, far behind and understand, human populations have been in transit for all of human history. But we can go back even just, let's say, a few decades, or even less than that, to the time in which in Europe there was a big discussion about multiculturalism. So just if we talk about the cultural sphere. And there was this moment where suddenly everyone said, the kind of conservative forces got together and said, including Merkel and I think it was Cameron at the time, multiculturalism is dead, this is the wrong way. And this is after the left had been criticizing multiculturalism for not having been advanced enough, and they were trying to kill it as a concept and wanting to have everyone follow some kind of light Kultur or something like this. Now, we're in a completely different situation. That whole debate was kind of forgotten. I don't see it anymore. I think if we just use the word exile and refugee to kind of brandmark and give some people who have arrived here a certain kind of category in which they can be active in, we're basically creating that wall and allowing ourselves to be content again to say, well, that's them, and this is the light Kultur. And that is going to be a major mistake in the long term. So if we don't, I think we have to get even beyond the concept of integration. Aside from going back, which is a whole nother story, and I don't really see that many people going back to Afghanistan very soon. Ukraine is an exception in this regard. But aside from that, I think we have to understand what it means not to integrate, because integrate means you become like the host culture. That's for me, it's still rather kind of not advanced enough way of thinking about cultural integration or advancement. And the way we talked about it in the past is to go beyond to something we call pluriculturalism, which is where you say there's multiple cultures, and when there's a new culture that joins it, it's not that they have to become like the existing hosting organization, the existing hosting culture. They have to actually see a balance between all the different cultures that find a new dialogue between one and another, right? And that's a different way of understanding how cultures interact and become a new culture. And that's why I like your idea very much of Berlin as an exile city, not because there's exiles in it, but because the city itself is made up of exiles. And that's the great strength of certain countries. I mean, why was France the capital of the 19th century? In a way, it was because it was a culture of exiles, right? Why was the United States the capital of the 20th century? Well, because everybody went there and they were accepted as Americans. Now, that is something Germany perhaps hasn't really understood yet, but it could, and that would be really the moment where you understand Germany versus
when it comes to visa procedure and visa bureaucracy, Germany has not understood it yet, and I think that's an important challenge which we maybe will discuss later on.
Which is not only reduced to Germany, but to the European Union. Let's be honest, it's.
But actually,
well, it differs. It differs. Really differs.
The French
stereotypically.
have a very different model. So it was very interesting with the French and the Afghan situation. I mean, just to kind of give an example. So when the German Foreign Ministry basically said, you can add yourself to this list. We'll consider the list. Maybe we'll green light you. And then a year later, many of those people on the list still haven't arrived. In France, they said, look, you're going to come here, and one day or another, you're going to declare asylum. So why don't you just come here and declare asylum right away? And you'll be an asylum seeker. What's the big deal? And so they had thousands and thousands of people becoming like asylum seekers from one day to the next, and they said, c'est la vie, and that's going to happen anyway. Mm-hmm. And it was a very different model. They say, you're going to be here. Okay.
Maybe it's just a comment. It's also because with Afghans, German expected that this Afghan artist at risk have a connection to Germany. They have some. We had to find them host. It's this, we were calling around and trying to find hosts before end of August and marking that they have some kind of connection to Germany. In France, they didn't expect that. Why should they have a prior connection to Germany? I don't know.
I want to take another step as well into another direction, maybe as well. Ask Per, because you have gained experience both from working in a liberal context, by working in Novosibirsk as well, and now being part of the management team of the Martin Roth Initiative. How would you describe the challenges actually that you face within these two positions? And we talked about it a little bit in our preparation talk. When you were in Russia dealing with this illiberal context, is it the work you're doing is like really artists at risk as well? You are kind of it's not the classical cultural work that we are doing there. So what is the challenge that you're facing, what you were facing there, and now within this Martin Roth Initiative, what are the potential and the limitations as well of these institutions like the Martin Roth, and you mentioned the visa issues. This is probably one of the major limitations, but what are the challenges and the potential actually that you see there as well?
Yeah, well, the challenges, I think, working in a country like Russia has to do with the setting there. If you want to support the civil society in this country, if you want to support brave artists, the question is, how far can you go? How far can you also go without risking the safety of your staff, of the artists involved, and so on? When then a crisis hits, like the 24th of February, that also within Russia in that case triggered a very strong wave of suppression within the country, and a lot of people wanting to leave. The challenge is, of course, to be able to act fast. And to act fast, the biggest obstacle to that is the visa regimes, indeed. So we were able to get very fast within within 2 or 3 weeks to get visas, so at least people can leave the country as sort of an emergency exit, not a long-term visa, but short-term visa, and able to set up fast mobility grants that people get a bit of money to be able to buy a ticket to leave the country fast. But that's, of course, not a long-term solution. With Martin Roth, it's somewhat different. Martin Roth is not geared toward these super fast interventions, mainly because we work with host institutions. So whenever you want to set up people with host institutions, you want a longer term visa, you don't want people just to come for 3 months, for longer term, then you're in a situation where it's not going to happen from today till tomorrow. Or it's only in very rare, high profile cases where these kinds of really quick moves happen. And we've had cases like this where it happens, but this is only when you have sort of interventions from the highest levels. I think the challenge the real challenge is to synchronize the different initiatives from the point of view of a Goethe-Institut, only within this one institution. We now have Martin Roth, who does certain things. We have Ukraine Fund that does certain things. We have within Russia certain programs that we have set up. We have this Goethe in Exile project. But to coordinate these things, to make sure that they interact in a proper way, I think is challenge even within a singular institutions, let alone being able to set up a proper coordinations with other NGOs and initiatives and so on, so that we don't have a situation that we have sort of a lot of tools that have grown out of a specific need at a specific time, but which build a patchwork that is not comprehensive. Because this is what the situation looks like to me at the moment. So I would say, yeah, that's perhaps some of the challenges we face.
You mentioned to act rapidly, and this is something that, for instance, artists at risk can do. And I wanted to ask you as well. I mean, you can react very differently than to new situations than, for instance, large institutions. While maybe not having, on the other hand, the same structural and financial support mechanisms there. But would you say that this is an advantage or kind of a challenge for your work? How do you see this kind of being agile on the one hand, and on the other hand, being this activistic NGO in a way? Huh?
Yeah, I think it's. Is this mic working?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in our case, as you say, that it's often we act. It's, for example, that it's just talking about it's for example, about Martin Roth, that we know that somebody has applied for Martin Roth, they approach us, they are waiting for the decision. We relocate people, that if they have a prison sentence coming up, they can't wait, they just have to get out. We have a network, it's basically in Schengen area, outside of Schengen area, and even within EU, there are different visa policies. And we can, for example, bring people to Finland with tourist visa pretty fast and turn that visa to a work permit without going back to country of origin, but you can do it in Finland. So we actually, it's often move people from one place to another. We relocate people, if they have to leave Schengen area, we relocate them to Serbia, to Belgrade, and then we continue the paperwork there. So I think that this is something that we can do within Artists at Risk kind of network, because it's peer-to-peer network, and we have its permanent hosting organizations. As Ivor said, that before the war in Ukraine broke out, we had kind of 26 solid hosting institutions from Goa to Tunis to Belgrade to Helsinki and so on. And now, of course, there are several new institutions who are also already has engaged and will stay in the network, and that's what we emphasize. It's not about solidarity to Ukraine, but it's also solidarity to all artists at risk. So I would say that that's our strength, is basically that when there are urgent cases, we can relocate people pretty fast, and then we start to think about the next steps. We were just in the conference of PEN International, for example, and when it comes to poets and writers, there are often these kind of cases that people are really on the edge of kind of it's this murder or being imprisoned, and they can't simply wait for 6 months for the decision. They just have to get out. And I think there we should cooperate much more with this find a ways to work with these longer-term relocation programs, which have more resources than we do. Our finances is a patchwork from many kind of foundations, governments, and so on. And that's something is good about our funding model, that we have also funding sources from the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Swedish Arts Council to UNESCO to private foundations and so on, that we are also kind of independent of one government policies or politics, that we can kind of do the fast decisions is together with our core group and start to work when the situation happens.
This brings me to the question of international versus national. Of course, there's this need for cooperation on the national level, but as well on the international level. You've been active as well. You said it's not just Borders Without Borders Germany, but it's Borders Without Borders International. From this experience, what would you say as well? This international coordination, is it happening as well in this field of the media, like media and endangered media persons, or is it something that you are longing for as well that is not yet happening?
No, I would say that it's quite efficient. Since many years, for example, there are some not that publicly visible networks where we really pool resources. For example, one of the most efficient networks where we since many years are active is called Journalists in Distress. I think we don't even have a website or something. It's basically a signal group where actually in times of crisis, actually, where global organization being active in the field of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of information, very spontaneously pool resources, knowledge on visa regimes and so on, where we really more or less, coordinate our efforts. I mean, Afghanistan last year, I really have to say, was an exception because everything broke down as well, our own structures on the ground. And this, I mean, like many organizations which have been active on the ground, I mean, this was a major crisis, not only for the people who we actually got out, but as well, honestly speaking, for our own organization, because it was just overwhelming, the enormous number of requests which we had to handle. So yes, but I think this works quite well, I would have to say, and the good thing about it is I think this is because it's so informal, but I mean the level of informality makes it so efficient, I would say.
That's a good point. Actually, this effectiveness is something I wanted to address as well, maybe for the whole group as well. Do you think that the structures that we have on the ground now, and we have different representatives here, are effective as well? Is it something where you say this, or where would you maybe recommend to kind of go into another sort of reorganization of these structures? What would you say? Maybe any of you.
I mean, I think that one of the ways, I mean, of course, we're always going to be stuck within various guidelines of different kind of interest groups, right? And the nation is one of them. Europe is another. And then there's private foundations which have their interests. And if it's Augstein Foundation, I'm sure they have a political agenda of some kind. And so each one of them has their own tendencies. But I think what we could do, I mean, in order to help the actual people at risk, is to create this kind of informal transition from one funding regime to another. So that, for example, as Marita mentioned, we often get applications from artists or cultural workers who are, waiting for an answer from, some large organization that's promising them perhaps 1 year, perhaps 2 years. Let's say in Sweden, there's a big organization. And they can wait for 5 years for that answer to come along, and maybe it never comes. And so in the meantime, we have to be able to fill that gap. And so I think that the synergies have to be developed more. And one of the interesting things, and I would like to hear actually what your work is at the UNESCO and how that Germany is involved in that, is that UNESCO for the first time now has been funding Artists at Risk, our organization, for female Ukrainian artists. And just for you to get the audience might not understand the scale. I mean, for 30 female artists at risk, they gave us $110,000, just about 110,000 euros. Can you imagine? That's how much money you need for 30 Ukrainian artists for 3 months each. That's a lot of money, and it's only 30. And if you have 1,700 on the list, you can kind of calculate, right? And so we have to imagine, how could we pool our resources in a more efficient way? Is it possible for nations to come together on a more European level at least, or perhaps even on the UNESCO level? And is it only for those who are kind of like in your neighborhood, right? So it turns out that it was mainly, I think, a Swedish and Norwegian funder that actually pushed a UNESCO grant to go through for Ukrainian artists. We had asked previously for Afghan funding, and they, the staff is fully diverse at UNESCO, but they couldn't get the backing. And so we need to understand, is it possible to push for an internationalization of these organizations?
Matthias, you worked at the Musantum, who was working within this network as well of independent production houses, and of course there's probably as well an international dimension to this, to your work as well. Would you kind of subscribe to what he said, what Ivo said?
Yeah, I think that mainly the question that was risen up here before, like what do people want to do afterwards, after having spent a year or two, after having maybe survived a very dangerous situation in one's own country, what has happened maybe then to the structures, to the networks those people come from, those people used to work in. So can we, it's a tricky question as well, because it will be different. It's a different situation in each country. It's if you come from the outside and invest in a Russian infrastructure, you'll be called, and everybody in this structure will be called a foreign agent. So it's a tricky and not so pauschal to be answered question. But can we invest in those structures, in the future of those structures? Can we, as for example, I'm coming from the field of performing arts, same in visual arts, of course, the work of artists is a more collective one. It's based on entities, on structures, on places. Like the way Birgit Lengers is working in Deutsches Theater, or the Schaubühne has just worked with stars in the Left Bank Theater in Ukraine, how to involve also those institutions, those structures, even if they are not really very operative in the moment, or even if they don't have, when we do this with Rabia and Matthias Lienthal, we work with Ashkal Avan, which is, of course, it's not operative in the moment. There is no physical and financial means. The people are not there in the moment, but can we somehow contribute to maintain or to give at least a perspective, to make a partnership also on that level? Because I think that is a very important background for those people we're talking about.
I'm looking a little bit at the time as well, and I want to open the panel as well to the audience. Maybe a last question, which is maybe a little bit a selfish question, because we're sitting here in the Goethe-Institut in Exile, which is, as I said in the beginning, a complete new way of thinking cultural exchange for us. And well, we had this first experience of Goethe-Institut Damascus in Exile in 2016. The aim is today really to establish a kind of format, a project space that can react on the long term to different forms of cultural repression. And we have focus countries. We are now have the Ukrainian focus. We have Belarus. We have Afghanistan and Syria. But we will most certainly have as well, and we have to work as well with cultural partners from other countries where our cultural activities are currently not possible. And I'm thinking of Iran, of Myanmar, of Russia. How does this resonate with you? Then what would your recommendation actually be for this kind of space that we are in, like the Goethe-Institut in Exile? Is it something, or where would you, from your experiences, from your different experiences, what would you recommend as well, should this, that this space should look like, or should act? Maybe as well to each of you when this question.
I think that kind of syncs very well with what you were saying. The idea of a kind of collective work with several artists at risk who have their links, their networks, and so on before they're exiled, and that their structures actually give them the meaning that they had in their countries of origin, and to somehow sustain those. Because if we don't sustain them, then how can you go back and rebuild that culture of democracy and forms of culture which were super important to allowing them to flourish in their original countries. So how do we do that? Now, this would be what this institution could be doing in the next 2 years, right? That if that's the question that you're asking, right? You could invite collectives, but without ghettoization. So this is again the question you asked at the beginning of this, exile being overused, and then you fall into a category, and you're just like, you're one of those. So there's that two-way thinking.
I continue from there. It's kind of just the practice. I now use Finland as an example. I mean, we are used in other countries as well, not in Germany. But it's basically combining to what you said, that it's very important to involve. I believe you also have the same system that, like in Finland, that theaters have one network, music has one network and union, that they should be involved in that work, because that's how we work, for example, in Finland, that before an artist arrives, they are the ones who find the work opportunities and networks, which means it's basically, and in that case, let's say that Theater in Finland has worked a lot in Russia, so they actually even know the Russian dissident theater directors and people who had to get out. So we got many of them out in March already. But it's very important from this perspective, it's not the ghetto, to actually get those institutions to be part of the work, because they have in whole of Germany, their networks, and when they know the artistic profiles of the people, so actually they can give them, it is basically jobs. And in Finland already we have several new commissions, there are new productions, so that they are part from the beginning of actually programming. Now, for example, it is both Ukrainians, Russian dissidents, people from Iraq, you name it. So I think it's very important also in this space to have this kind of central organizations, it's artist unions, this is umbrella organizations, not only individual kind of institutions from certain field of art, but also them, it's kind of making it happen.
Thank you.
I mean, first of all, I think it's a big step that Goethe et al. Has gone to say we're doing exile projects now, and we're not just closing institutes, but we are continuing the work there. But I think one thing that is worthwhile thinking about is whether we should wait until an institute closes, whether we should think so much in national terms. Now we have Ukraine, then we have Afghanistan, and so on. Because what we are seeing in many institutes around the world is that they might still be there, but they might not be able to do the work they used to be able to do a few years ago or something. So that some activities they will still be able to do in the country, other activities they would need to do in exile, be it in the near abroad, be it in a city like Berlin that perhaps can become something like a capital of exile. And I think that would be sort of perhaps a long-term ideal, that it becomes less focused on individual nations, on 3 months for this country, 3 months for that country, but we really say this is we integrate it in our institutions as a long-term way of thinking that there will always be exile communities and they will also profit from each other.
Maybe following on this, two very practical recommendations. First of all, I appreciate very much the initiative, the program, which is this exile approach by Goethe-Institut. And maybe one thing actually that I think such an initiative for the future, I think should, following on what Per said actually, from the very initial career, someone starting at a Goethe-Institut director, actually part of the education, part of the training program should be training about protection mechanism. Protection actually is as a kind of the new normal, and I think it's maybe a practical offer. We are very happy actually to exchange our knowledge. We do this, by the way, with the Foreign Office as part of their attaché education program annually with the new diplomats. Actually, we do really have a kind of practical exchange, and maybe, I mean, there's some knowledge which we could exchange, and this is in times where actually illiberal regimes getting more. This is maybe part of your training program. The second remark. Don't concentrate only on Germany. Don't concentrate only on Germany with the exile community. Concentrate maybe on the neighboring countries where maybe sometimes actually the exile perspective can be much more effective because it's closer to the origin, because the visa regime is easier to manage. And I think this is something which actually maybe has to not only your task, but this is maybe a political decision, I know. But there, of course, talk to the government, to the stakeholders in governments who have to rethink as well maybe the concept of exile, that not only Germany is a country for exile.
Yeah, I think it's like when I lived out and worked outside Germany, or when I visited other countries, I perceived lately the Goethe-Institut really as an institution that is highly investing in local networks and in strengthening social, civic, and cultural work in the cities and countries where they are based. And without the necessity, I don't know, to bring Albert Ostermeier over and to read those people some poems in German, or to show them some Thomas Ostermeier performances or something. It's really, and that is of course, I think, a brilliant and global development. And I see, of course, the concept to not close your institutes once you have to close them at the space, but to continue them in exile as a network, as a place where people still can connect to, even if you're not physically there anymore because you're not allowed to. I think that's a very, very good step. And I think, yes, the next step is like to bring some others with you to their exiles and to support them as long as they have to be in exile, also on the structural level and in the institutional level, not only on the personal level. I think that's I think that's brilliant work.
Thank you very much. So I will open now the questions as well to the audience. There is already one question I can see. I will give you my mic because we...
Hello, it's not so much a question, but rather a compliment, more or less, also to the people on stage. My name is Constanza, and I work for a national organization in the visual arts, but assembling many regional organizations in Germany also. And while listening to you, I couldn't help of thinking of all the illiberal tendencies in all the countries, actually, at the moment. And, sorry. And this summer you opened the setup together with Artists at Risk, saying that if smaller organizations, and especially not the institutions, not the Berliner Festspiele, not the Deutsches Theater, the smaller institutions, organizations like maybe you, Marita and Ivor, used to work with or opened up yourself, could apply in supporting artists coming to Germany looking for exile. This was really the way to go, and I would really like to congratulate you on this and go on working on this in the next years with Goethe in Exil, because this is also a way, it's not only Berlin, you have to go to the countryside and you have to support the smaller grassroots institutions. No, not institutions, organizations. Yeah.
Could I just briefly respond to that?
Of course, yeah.
And not directly to that, but I think that it's important to understand that, like, we work with large institutions, small institutions, but I think it's again, what we're thinking about is, again, it's not about only the metropolitan centers, right? And it's not only about helping others. We have to get over this, what used to be called the white man's burden, okay? We have to stop saying, patting ourselves on the back, we did a great job, look how good we are. We have to say, these people are put at risk because of what we have been doing in the world. And I think it's been mentioned. We have a certain responsibility to what has, all these crises, especially in Afghanistan, partially also in Ukraine. So to stop patting ourselves on the back and saying how great we are, we've given them money, helped these people, we've helped and saved lives. No, we're actually working with artists who are like us, okay? We're working with curators, directors, museum directors, festival directors from amazing kind of, level art. Marita mentioned that these are really, really, we have the privilege of working with them. And therefore, this can only be sucked into the center of Europe, into Berlin, and used as our cultural capital. That would be wrong. So we have to think beyond the moment of crisis. We have to think where it's a brain drain coming here, right? So what we have to say, yes, we have to go to the small towns and convince those very AfD people in Sachsen that, yeah, those are really amazing artists, and you're going to learn something from them. They don't have to learn from you how to be a good Sachse, So these are the kind of things we have to understand about the process of learning, right? And I think also in Europe, that Germany is very strong. But it's not good for Germany to be too strong independently. We've learned that, right? I think. Have we learned that? I hope so. So Germany can't be too strong independently, okay? In my opinion and my family history, I think that's been proven too many times. We have to understand that we need to have a Europe that is not centralized, not focused only on one country, and we need to be able to cooperate between these multiple capitals and regional organizations. So thanks for that. That kind of sparked a certain level of kind of flattening of the hierarchy.
I think there was first here, over there.
Yeah, hello, good night. Thank you very much for your insights in your work. I was actually wondering, and I think that's a question for you actually, because you were referring back to quote-unquote protection mechanisms being part of a matter of interest, and I was very cautious when I heard the word interest, because I was wondering in what way or to what extent are you defining interest, or like how far can you actually define an interest regime, and what way is it not maybe also becoming an expression of a binary opposite, which can again reproduce or engender the very things that we're trying to protect artists from. Like I'm thinking, for instance, of China, where precisely these hardening political interests regimes have become or are at the heart of why things have become very difficult for artists in China. So my question, I guess, is, like, to what extent can you define these interests?
I don't know if I can define them in sort of one definition that will last for years and decades to come. I think the point I was trying to make is that if we only appeal towards politicians by saying we have a moral obligation, or it's sort of a matter of altruism or a matter of ethics, then we have then we will only reach certain politicians that agree with us. If we frame our cause in a broader sense, where we say it's also part of to be honest, a geopolitical struggle between certain forces, then I think we are able to build broader coalitions. So that's one point. The other point is simply it's much smaller. It's from an institutional point of view. If my colleagues now, say in Belarus or somewhere else, work with people, work with artists on the ground, gives them a floor, and they end up at risk afterwards because of projects that we've been doing with them, I think we have an interest to support those people, because otherwise we lose credibility and we won't be able to do these more daring projects in the future.
I heard it come up a little bit, but I'm very interested in artists that work in collective identity structures, because it seems to me with all of the rising authoritarian regimes all over the planet at the moment, it makes a lot of sense for artists to work under a collective identity. If you have an artist coming from a repressive regime coming into EU or Germany and become some kind of like dissident celebrity, that person could actually wind up being in exile for quite a long time because it makes it difficult for them to go back to where they're coming from in the art that they're doing against a particular regime. So I'm wondering if it's been thought of before to think of collective structures from artists at risk to come together in Europe and work from different regions together on a project, for one thing. And also, in this opening up that kind of conversation, I'm wondering if there's anything to learn from what very interesting experiment at the Documenta this year, where a collective is able to curate something within Europe in their own ways of doing that. And when that possibility is opened up to artists in Europe, it also allows them to sort of sub-curate something. So allowing them to invite other people into their project and perhaps even avoiding some of the bureaucracies, or when you get funding from organizations that try to control a lot of what those artists want to accomplish. Creating more of these collective structures could actually open up all kinds of new levels of freedom of expression from my perspective. So I wonder if we could open that up.
I think that it's really much up to those artists, is basically who come. Of course, you need kind of open funding structures for that. But in our experience, I mean, it's kind of artists who arrive. What is very important that they don't arrive is as an Egyptian dissident if they don't want to. I mean, they can be artists on their own conditions. I think that's very, very crucial. I mean, it's basically that if you are a visual artist, you can be visual artist. It's basically you don't have to represent it's anything. That of course you can. It's work individually or you can form a collective structure. But I think that has to come. It's within those artists who are arriving, and I think that is the challenge that too often institutions do. The invitation is to represent. It's if you are, for example, Kurdish artist, of course, I mean, it's basically, if you are engaged artist, it might be that you want to work in that topic, but it might be that you want to work on something totally different. We are now hosting, it's well-known, it's Russian dissident theater director Mikhail Durnikov, and he wrote a new commission, a play about ecological disaster, which of course very much connects to the war and so on. But I think that is very important that we keep it open. I mean, it's how artists who arrive, how do they want to work? What kind of forms they want to form? We shouldn't give this guidance from the institutions. We should give funding structures which enable them to work it out. I think that's very important.
Can I just add to that? I mean, that's one kind of saying the artists have to decide for themselves. And in our program, we never expect any kind of work whatsoever. And they work 10 times more than ordinary artists in residence, ironically, even though nothing is demanded of them. But on the other hand, you know, it does also mean something when you give some kind of opportunities. So we have things like what you're describing. We have something called the Artists at Risk Powwow. We kind of give it an open term. I hope it doesn't rub anyone the wrong way to use this term. It's a Native American term of getting together, and people can exchange freely in this channel and build their own projects internationally. So there are artists in Kenya and Zimbabwe talking to artists in Finland and in Russia, Armenia or Georgia, and they can develop something if they like. So that is the channel we do provide those open channels.
I think the question of collectives is a really important one. I think there's a tendency from the side of funders to have a fairly conservative view. That is the assumption that artists are individuals and that you fund individuals who apply individually for a grant you match them to a host institution who has the capacities to take up one artist. But of course, this is not how the artwork works. So what we're seeing is more and more that it's groups of people applying together, which in the end is challenging a bit our system of host organizations that take up individual artists. We're seeing it also from the point of, if I change the glasses now from Martin Roth to Goethe, that whole institutions go into exile. Not only Goethe goes into exile, but also self-organized initiatives, artist-run art spaces go into exile to some extent. And the question is, how can we deal with those structures? How can we keep those networks and structures, or help keep them alive somehow until a point where they can again work in the country where they are from, or where they can at least sort of, where we can at least try to make sure that not a whole artistic community infrastructure is destroyed through being scattered into exile. And I think that's really a challenge where there aren't so many answers to at the moment, because it also needs a different funding scheme. But sort of on a smaller level, I think we are there, and in individual cases, there are good best practices, but I don't think there's a broad solution yet for that.
Without doing wrong comparisons, but I think here it fits a bit. I mean, the approach of our JX fund basically is actually funding collectives, news collectives, complete newsrooms, and actually this is for us something different as well. I would say even in the protection scene, if one would like to say so, where very often our own assistant work, which we do since centuries, we focused very much on individuals, but now we created this new structure, and I think this really closed an existing gap, which I always observed actually, but never had the opportunity to close it actually. And in fact, actually, we now fund and we support complete structures. And this, in fact, as Per said, it's a totally different view. You have to design these kind of programs totally different, because you have to think in structures and not only in individuals. But I think there may be something which actually the art scene and the arts protection mechanism could much learn from our experience which we made, because I think that in the end the logistical, the bureaucratic questions I imagine are very similar to what actually newsrooms faces.
Maybe I think there are two levels in collectives. Is basically we relocate there is kind of hosting whole dance companies and so on when they come. But then it's, for example, now we are experimenting is in Moos. It's here in Berlin. We have a collective residency of 6 artists from Afghanistan and 3 from Ukraine. And our matchmakers were talking to each and every one of the artists that do they want to be in a collective residency, because it's totally different experiences basically. And then we also have supported, for example, back in Afghanistan, a collective called Polisorg in Safe House, because it was from 8 to 10 artists who actually were in Safe House, which we relocated, and now they are finally coming out. So I think that in these collectives there are also very many levels, that there are existing collectives who come to exile, but then their work might change in exile. It is also, that's one aspect, that is that collective might also change, and there are these new collectives then forming. It is also when you are in exile.
Yeah, I tried to be short, and thank you. I just wanted to actually comment on that, because what I've been seeing with JX Fund and other programs for journalists for also getting support for setting up new entities or new NGOs or some kind of new structure, I see this is also something that comes more and more into practice now with cultural organizations or collectives or any kind of, well, spaces that are completely leaving their countries. But I wanted to stress one expression, I think it was mentioned by you, Matthias, about Berlin as an exile city. And I see the responsibility that you were talking in the beginning also within the cities, the municipalities, or the Berlin Senate in this case, and also to give like some kind of public. And I was wondering if you have any plans or ideas how that can be more improved. The cooperation like within the municipalities or building up networks. I know there's a network also with these shelter cities. I think it comes from the Netherlands and more from the human rights area, but maybe there are also some ideas or plans for the future for that.
Maybe one very practical experience. I think this does not only refer to Berlin, but to other municipalities in Germany as well. I mean, in this year, actually, we have been confronted with so many requests by media organizations, by cities. We want to set up some certain program, and I think in March and April, I never experienced something similar. Everybody wanted to help and to do something, but everybody wanted to do short-term things. And with regards to municipalities and to city administrations, most of the cities we have been in touch wanted to say, we want to do another fellowship program. So, but we have fellowship programs are not the solution for a situation in exile. It's a temporary maybe solution if you left the country. But when you get into the discussions, we need long-term solution, long-term support, sustainable structural support. This is something different, and I think this is a political way, and this is a political mind shift which is needed. And I observed this in many municipalities in Germany. And I had this year so many discussions with even local. With cities here in Germany, they have been very similar. So overcome short-term thinking.
I think that we also should maybe divide it a little bit more between the actual emergency hosting situation, which we all provide to some extent, all these different organizations, and the artistic side, because the artistic or the journalistic kind of practice involves, becoming a professional in the new context. And that's where new projects can be formed, new, kind of economic models can be developed that can be able to make these organizations or collectives or individuals self-sustaining. And that's the long-term goal, right? Is to have self-sustaining, self-organizing, independent individuals or collectives. And I think this is where, okay, we can do the emergency work, right? Maybe it's 1 year, even that is very short, really, in the span of a lifetime, to be able to set up your entire life anew. And so how can we do that? And I think what we need is really great programming. So we need amazing programming from the artistic and creative minds, and to work together with us to help develop what we're trying to do is a decentralized artist at risk event series that allows all the artists in the program, and there's hundreds, to be able to communicate with another and develop artistic programs.
Yeah, I think we should somehow overcome a certain cliche of internationality. Living, of course, in not only Berlin, but especially in Berlin, in cities that are like so international, but nobody has to travel anymore here to represent internationality. The diversity of the cities, of course, it's a very complex and, of course, not to be confounded question, because, of course, a diverse city is not consisting of just big diversity of artists, but of many different people with many of them not very, not so much expectations towards culture and arts, because all those institutions come from very, one-directed and one-tradition-based backgrounds. So I think that's a question that is what I said before. We are much more involved in those questions of exile, of migration, of refuge, or whatever, whenever and for whatever it might have happened since decades, and we have realized it, especially in a country like Germany, quite late, that this is the fact. And of course, the city of Berlin, it's the place where if you are an artist and you're not born in Germany and you've not been risen learning the German language, you can live and work here for 20 years. That's fine. That's not possible in every German city, and even not in the art scene. No? So that's why this is in a certain way a capital, and has been. And for exile there are so many reasons. There's also there's not only political reasons. There's we know that there's all kinds of reasons. And maybe I lived in an exile for 9 years of my life because I wanted to. Nobody forced me to leave somewhere. But of course, the situation you are in that moment means that you have to redefine what you do, with whom you do it, in which context you do it, the networks you do it, and that is a new beginning of something, and usually for several people that come together. So
we have one last, and then of course we have to close. And afterwards, one last comment, please. Thank you.
Question: do you know? As it's not to artists at risk because they know. Do you know how bad message you left as Goethe-Institut after you left East European countries and then you go home? Why you are not in Poland? Why you don't exile at home in Berlin? Why you're not in the close to Polish border? Poland is still European Union. Everybody loved it that you left. The Polish government, the other governments. I mean, that's a so bad message. You know that?
We still are active in Poland. We still have.
I know. Yeah. Everybody know that for years. But you left. You closest places close to the border, European Union, and you go home. You should. It would be much better when you would open new space. Exile, really in exile for you, not at home in Berlin. Somewhere close to the Polish border, where the refugees are. 2 million in that one country only. And you go home.
Okay, that's a comment that we will take in consideration. And but I think we have to close the panel today, and this was the last panel, actually, as I said in the beginning. But it's not the end of the discussion, actually. We have till end of 2024, at least for now. That's what we are planning. And this discussion series is something that we want to continue as well. We want to really engage with actors on the ground, with you and the others that we had on these other panels and the other days. So it's something that we will look forward to, and I want to thank you all for being here, for taking part in the discussion, for participating in this Goethe-Institut in Exile, for you as well for participating here. And we look forward to continue this exchange with you and this constructive exchange. It has been very enriching, and I think we will take a lot out of it. Thank you very much. Thank you.